It was a pioneer's weathered face, a no-nonsense face, the face of American Gothic. But it was also a face etched with years of disappointment. Disappointment that would shade and shape the life of his famous son, just as the Disney tenacity, drive, and pride would. In July 1834, Arundel Elias Disney, Elias Disney's grandfather, set out from Ireland for America with his older brother Robert and Robert's wife and their 2 children. They had intended to settle in America, but Arundel Elias moved to the wilderness of southwestern Ontario, Canada, and bought 149 acres along the Maitland River. In time, Arundel Elias built the area's first grist mill and a sawmill, farmed his land, and fathered 16 children. In 1858, the eldest of them, 25-year-old Keppel, who had come on the boat with his parents, married another Irish immigrant named Mary Richardson, and moved just north to Bluevale in Morris Township, where he bought 100 acres of land and built a small pine cabin. There, his first son, Elias, was born on February 6, 1859. Keppel Disney was not the kind of man inclined to stay on a farm forever. When oil was struck nearby in what came to be known as Oil Springs, Keppel rented out his farm, deposited his family with his wife's sister, and joined a drilling crew. He was gone for 2 years, during which time the company struck no oil. He returned to his farm, only to be off again, this time to drill salt wells. He returned a year later, again without his fortune, built himself a new frame house on his land, and reluctantly resumed farming. Hearing of a gold strike in California, he set out in 1877 with 18-year-old Elias and his second eldest son, Robert. They got only as far as Kansas, when Keppel changed plans and purchased just over 300 acres from the Union Pacific Railroad, which was trying to entice people to settle at division points along the train route it was laying through the state. The area in which the family settled, Ellis County, in the northwestern quadrant of Kansas, about halfway across the state, was frontier and rough. Keppel, tired of the cruel Kansas weather, decided to join a neighbor family on a reconnaissance trip to Lake County, in the middle of Florida, where the neighbors had relatives. Elias went with him. For Elias, Florida held another inducement besides the promise of warm weather and new opportunities. The neighbor family they had accompanied, the Calls, had a 16-year-old daughter named Flora. Keppel returned to Ellis shortly thereafter. Elias stayed on with the Calls. Elias delivered mail from a horse-drawn buckboard and courted Flora. Their marriage, at the Calls' home on New Year's Day, 1888, wedded the intrepid determination of the Disneys with the softer, more intellectual temper of the Calls. Marriage, however, didn't change his fortunes. He had bought an orange grove, but a freeze destroyed most of his crop, forcing him back into delivering the mail. In the meantime, Charles Call had an accident while clearing some land of pines, never fully recovered, and died early in 1890. His death loosened the couple's bond to Florida. The Disney wanderlust and the need to escape would send Elias back north, this time to Chicago. He had been preceded to Chicago by Robert Disney, Elias's younger brother, by 2.5 years. 6 months after Elias married Flora, Robert had married a wealthy Boston girl named Margaret Rogers and embarked on his career of speculation in real estate, oil, and even gold mines. He had come to Chicago in 1889 in anticipation of the 1893 Columbian Exposition, which would celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, and had built a hotel there. Elias had also come for the promise of employment from the fair, but his dreams were humbler. Living in his brother's shadow, he was hoping for work not as a magnate, but as a carpenter. The Disneys arrived in Chicago late in the spring of 1890 with their infant son Herbert and with Flora pregnant again. Elias rented a one-story frame cottage at 3515 South Vernon on the city's south side, an old mid-19th century farmhouse, now isolated amid much more expensive residences. Construction on the fair began early the next year, after Flora had given birth that December to a second son, Ray. Elias earned only $1 a day as a carpenter, but he was industrious and frugal, and by the fall he had saved enough to purchase a plot of land for $700 through his brother's real estate connections. By the next year, he had applied for a building permit at 1249 Tripp Avenue to construct a 2-story wooden cottage for his family, which the following June would add another son, Roy O. Disney. Using Robert's contacts and leveraging his own house through mortgages, he began designing residences with Flora's help and then building small cottages for working men like himself. By the end of the decade, he and a contracting associate had built at least 2 additional homes on the same street on which he lived, one of which he sold for $2,500, and the other of which he and his partner rented out for income. Both the Disneys and the Calls had been deeply religious, and Elias and Flora's social life in Chicago now orbited the nearby Congregational Church, of which they were among the most devoted members. Occasionally, when the minister was absent, Elias would even take the pulpit. It would become embedded in Disney family lore that when Flora had a baby boy in the upper bedroom of their Tripp house on December 5, 1901, the child's name was part of a pastoral bargain. As the story went, Flora and the wife of the new young minister, Walter Parr, were pregnant at the same time. Elias and Parr agreed that if their wives both had sons, Elias would name his after the minister, and the minister would name his after Elias. This was supposedly how Elias and Flora's new baby came to be named Walter Elias Disney. The story, however, was only partly true. The Disney's second son, Ray, may have originally been named Walter. That was the name on his birth registration, before the family reconsidered, which suggests that the Disneys had thought of the name previously. The confusion would spur rumors later on about whether Walt was actually the Disneys' natural-born child, especially since Walt had no birth certificate, only a baptismal certificate. Young Walter Elias Disney was scarcely 4 years old in 1906 when Elias decided yet again to move. 2 neighbor boys, the same ages as Herbert and Ray, and from an equally devout St. Paul's family, had attempted to rob a car barn and had killed a policeman during a shootout. Terrified that his own boys might be led astray, especially since the neighborhood was growing rougher, Elias began searching for a more salubrious environment, settling on a remote Missouri town where his brother Robert had recently purchased some farmland as an investment. Walt Disney would remember Marceline, Missouri, more vividly than anything else in his childhood. Uncle Robert's property, a mile west, was nearly 500 acres, while Elias had purchased only 40 acres on March 5, 1906, from the children of a Civil War veteran named Crane, who had died recently, and then bought just over 5 acres more the next month from Crane's widow. Game abounded. There were foxes, rabbits, squirrels, opossums, and raccoons. And there were birds. Of the 45 acres, 5 were planted with orchards, apple, peach, and plum trees with grapevines and berry plants. And there were a hog pen, chickens, a few milk cows, and horses. The town was no less enchanting than the farm. Though it qualified as frontier, Marceline was sedate, even refined. Marceline was a hotbed of support for the Democratic populist William Jennings Bryan, and it prided itself on its progressivism. In Marceline, Walt saw his first circus and attended his first Chautauqua, a traveling tent show that prominently featured the leading orators.